Hi, welcome to our course on stakeholder management. And in the first module, I want to explore with you, what do we mean by stakeholders? So stakeholders are individuals or groups within an organization who have a significant interest in or an influence over a buying decision. Now, each of these stakeholders will typically have different roles, responsibilities, and perspectives. And all of those things can affect the outcome of the decision. Now, different stakeholders will also inevitably have different levels of power, of influence, and of authority over the decision-making process. So we're going to explore all of these elements as we go through this course. Well, let's start by trying to understand how many stakeholders are likely to be involved. And as we'll see in a moment, while in simple, low value buying decisions, these can sometimes be made by a single stakeholder. Today's high value, complex B2B purchase decisions typically involve multiple stakeholders. In fact, the latest research suggests that there's an average of 8 to 12 stakeholders actively involved in some part or all of complex, high value, high stakes B2B buying decision journeys and processes. And that number's been growing. And actually, in some opportunities, the number may well be north of that. Now, in part, I think this is driven by wanting to avoid making a bad decision that fails to deliver the desired outcomes. And that's a factor which is known as FOMO. In other words, the fear of messing up. So organizations have become increasingly unwilling to commit to significant high impact decisions unless they perceive there's a sufficient degree of consensus across key members of the stakeholder group. And one of the consequences of that, of course, is that decisions are taking longer. Now, of course, as I mentioned a moment ago, different stakeholders are inevitably going to have different levels of power and authority over the decision-making process and journey. And some will inevitably be more influential than others, but even the powerful ones may try and seek consensus before moving forward. So our role as salespeople has got to be to identify, to engage, to assess, and to persuade as many of these key stakeholders as possible, but also to do all that we can to help to facilitate consensus across our prospective customers' stakeholder community. It's a pretty important focus. Now, I think there are three particularly important influential stakeholder roles. Typically, buying decisions involve multiple stakeholders, but I want to highlight three roles in particular because they appear to be particularly important in high value, significant B2B buying decision journeys. Now, the first one are the solution champions, the next, the executive sponsors, and finally, the ultimate approvers, sometimes known as economic buyers. Now, any of these roles are capable of initiating a buying decision journey within your prospective customer. But all of these roles are usually critical to achieving a positive outcome. Now, the thing is, these different roles are typically seeking answers to different questions. If you put yourself in the shoes of a solution champion, they're probably asking, which option is most likely to deliver the required functionality and make me look like a hero? The executive sponsor's probably thinking something along the lines of, will this project enable me to achieve my most important operational priorities and at the same time make me look like a hero? And when it comes to the ultimate approvers or economic buyers, they're probably thinking something along the following lines. They're probably thinking, how important is this project And will the return justify the investment? And will it make the best use of available resources? So you see quite different perspectives and questions. Now, these roles, naturally, if you think about it, are also going to have different priorities and perspectives that match their responsibilities. So we go back to the solution champions, and we might characterize this role as the person or the people who are responsible for evaluating and recommending the most appropriate solution to the issue. They need to be willing and able to proactively promote their preferred solution to the other key stakeholders. Otherwise, the project might fall flat because of that. And they'll need to convince the executive sponsors and the ultimate approvers of the merits of their preferred solution. Now, I think the other thing that's characteristic of solution champions is they rarely have the final decision about budget, except for very low value, somewhat transactional deals. So let's look at it from the executive sponsor's position and perspective. Well, very often the exec sponsor or sponsors will be operational heads of the department or functions that are most affected by the issue. And they need to be able to willing and able to proactively promote the merits of this project to the ultimate approvers. They need to be willing to listen to the opinions of the experts, the solution champions, that they respect. And they'll sometimes have the final decision over budget, but they may still need, even if a budget's been allocated, they still may need to get the ultimate approvers on board. So if we now think about the priorities, position, and perspectives of the ultimate approvers, these are the people who has or have the ultimate authority as to whether or not the project goes ahead. And even if they're responsible for initiating a project, at some point in the evolution of the project, they'll often delegate the details to executive sponsors and solution champions. And they'll expect then the executive sponsors and solution champions to convince them of their recommendations. Now, these people are almost always able to reallocate budget to fund their top priority initiatives. And sometimes that involves taking budget away from already funded other projects. Now, if you think about these roles and responsibilities, it becomes pretty obvious that they're likely to respond to different messages and that we can't afford to use one size fits all messages across these different roles. They're not going to resonate equally well. So we need to tailor our approach and our messages accordingly. So if we're engaged primarily with solution champions, well, they'll tend to be concerned about which option is most likely to deliver the required functionality. So our communications with them, our messaging needs to actually firstly ensure they actually find us in the place where they're likely to be looking for solutions in the early part of their buying journey. We need to position ourselves in the category of solution that they believe they're looking for. We need to positively differentiate our offering from their other options. And yes, we need to persuade them that we offer the most capable option. Now, we put ourselves in the shoes of the executive sponsor. They're likely to be concerned about whether the project is going to enable them to achieve their most important operational priorities. So when we're talking and messaging with them, some of the things we need to do are to educate them on the business issues we've chosen to target. We need to find ways of differentiating our approach to addressing those issues and not just talk about our capabilities. We need to be able to share confidence building case studies from similar organizations that these executive sponsors can relate to. And we need to persuade them that we offer the lowest risk option for achieving their desired outcomes and objectives. And then when we think about the mindset of the ultimate approver, well, they tend to be concerned about relative strategic priorities and things like the likely return on investment. So our messaging and our communication with the ultimate approvers needs to demonstrate to them how we support their strategic initiatives and priorities. It needs to focus on the desired outcomes rather than our capabilities. It needs to make a compelling case for investing in our solution. And it needs to help them to persuade them that this is one of their highest priority projects. So you can see that these roles need different messages. So who should we target and how should we engage? If we're proactively prospecting, we need to choose our initial targets carefully. But of course, if we're reacting to an inbound inquiry, we'll often want to identify and engage other stakeholders as early as possible. So let's think about solution champions first. If we're proactively prospecting, then under most circumstances, we'd probably want to reach out to a potential executive sponsor and only fall back on reaching out potential solution champions if we're not getting any response from those executive sponsors. But if we're reacting to an inbound inquiry, and if we realize that our initial contact is at best a potential solution champion, then of course we need to identify and find ways of engaging with the other stakeholders as soon as possible. Now, if we think about executive sponsors, now under most circumstances, if we're proactively prospecting and we're talking about business issues, we should primarily focus on reaching out to people who look to us to be potential exec sponsors and communicate with them about their likely key business issues. And if a potential executive sponsor reaches out to us, then one of the things we need to do, as well as engaging on the key business issues, is to ensure that we maintain direct contact with them, whilst with their help, we engage with other stakeholders. And then if we think about ultimate approvers, well, these are the most likely to be difficult to engage from cold. But if we succeed, then we must anticipate the need to be positively introduced to the person or people that the ultimate approver regards as the potential executive sponsor or sponsors for the project. And if this potential ultimate approver reaches out to us, then of course we want to ensure that we've got direct contact that we can maintain with them whilst being introduced to potential executive sponsors and other stakeholders. So there's some different ways of thinking about who to target and how to engage. Now, if it becomes obvious that our initial contact is none of these roles, for example, somebody who's really just an information gatherer, then it's particularly important that we move quickly to identify and engage somebody who is capable of fulfilling one of the above roles. Otherwise, we could find ourselves really getting stuck outside of the core stakeholder and decision maker community. Now, should we expect one stakeholder, a few, or many? Well, as you've probably seen, in particularly small, low value, transactional, non-strategic purposes, these core roles can sometimes be performed by the same individual. But in larger, more significant deals, they're usually separate. So in those low value transactional purchases, it is sometimes true that one person can make the decision, or that effectively user buyers are playing multiple roles. But if it's a high value, significant buying decision and journey, then it's almost inevitable that multiple people are going to need to agree before a decision can be made. And therefore, we should expect a large number of stakeholders to be involved, including specialists like legal, procurement, compliance, and so on. So, how do we go about identifying them? Well, there are usually more stakeholders than might at first appear. So everybody who's likely to be actively involved in the decision-making journey and the decision-making process is a candidate. And if that number of identified stakeholders appears to be low, almost certainly we're missing some of them, perhaps some very important ones. So one of the ways to kind of think about this is to look at the roles that have been involved in other similar successful opportunities and try and identify whether we're missing some of them in this current opportunity. Now, I would also counsel you not to ask your initial contact the direct question, are you the decision maker? It's much more helpful and productive, usually, to ask them who else has been involved in similar decisions and who's likely to be involved now. And I think the other thing to bear in mind is that the ultimate approvers, and of course, without them, the project's not going to go ahead, may only get actively involved in the process at something of a late stage. But it becomes very important that we're aware of who they are and we seek to influence them as early as we possibly can. Now, there's some very interesting dynamics in stakeholder groups. The dynamics are rarely simple and they're often complicated, but there are a few home truths. The first one is that not all stakeholders are equal. Some will inevitably have far more influence over the decision-making process than others. The ultimate approvers and the executive sponsor or sponsors are always amongst the most significant, but they often turn to people they regard as experts or solution champions for advice. And if there's a failure to achieve internal consensus across the whole stakeholder community, well, that's one of the main reasons why apparently promising projects get delayed or abandoned, because they've failed to get consensus across the stakeholder group. Now, some stakeholders have a positive role in decision making, but we also need to recognize that others, including some key specialists like compliance or procurement, may be able to delay or veto a decision. And at the end of the day, particularly in any sort of high value, high stakes, significant buying decision, it is always highly dangerous to rely on a single point of contact. And that doesn't matter how positive or influential that single contact appears to be. It's a very dangerous strategy. So what do we need to know about each key stakeholder? Well, I'm going to suggest there are 6 factors that you need to try and assess about each of those identified stakeholders. And the first one is, what's their primary perspective? How are they likely to look at the project? We'll come on to that in the next module. What role will they play in the decision-making process? What is their influence over the decision-making process? What is their attitude to the project? Are they very supportive of the project, neutral, or maybe it's not really very important to them? And what about their attitude to us? You'll notice I've split attitudes into those 2 questions, and I'll explain some of the rationale to that later. But it's entirely possible for somebody to have a positive attitude to us, but a somewhat neutral attitude to the project, and vice versa. And then finally, a very important question, ease of access. How easy is it to engage with each of these stakeholders? Now, I need to say to you that perfect knowledge is impossible. I acknowledge it is practically impossible to have perfect knowledge of the whole stakeholder community in any complex buying decision. But what I will tell you is that the more that you know, And the more that you recognize what you don't know, but you need to find out, the better your chances of ultimate success. So, a quick summary. What do we mean by stakeholders? Well, they are individuals or groups within an organization who have a significant interest in or an influence over a buying decision. We identified solution champions, exec sponsors, and ultimate approvers as being amongst the most important stakeholder types, but of course, they're not alone. Now, we also acknowledge that in very low value purchases, these roles can sometimes be performed by one individual, but in larger, more significant deals, these are almost always separate roles. And in fact, the latest research suggests that an average of 8 to 12 stakeholders are actively involved in some part or all of a typical complex, high value, high stakes buying decision process. Now, each of these stakeholders will themselves typically have different roles, different responsibilities, different perspectives, all of which can affect the outcome of the decision. And these different stakeholders will also have, inevitably, different levels of power and influence and authority over the decision-making process. And finally, our ultimate sales success depends on our ability to identify, to engage, and to know as much as possible about as many of the most powerful stakeholders as possible. So, we've come to the end of this module, and as usual in these courses, I want you to pause and reflect, and I want to ask you first, how has this module helped you to think differently? How has it maybe changed the way you think about the importance of identifying and understanding all of the stakeholders in your opportunities in response to some of these ideas? And more importantly, as a result of that reflection, what are you now going to do differently as a result? What are you determined to start doing? What do you now realize you need to stop doing? And how are you going to make what you were already doing even more effective as a result? And following that reflection, please make those commitments to yourself. What are you going to do differently? And make sure you write them down. You put them into practice. You evaluate the outcomes and you learn from that experience. It's really only by making those commitments to yourself and putting them into practice that you will successfully implement some of these thoughts. So there we have it. We've laid the foundations of stakeholder management. And I hope you'll want to put these principles into practice in both your current and your upcoming sales opportunities. And I wish you the very best of success in doing that. But I also hope that you'll want to join me online for our next module. And that's where we'll explore this idea of primary perspective in more detail. And I look forward to seeing you online for that in the very near future.